ideological garbage these jokers were spewing, and we didn't think it was important. Our Constitution survived a revolution and a civil war and 2 world wars. Why should we worry about a few German eggheads? Especially since America was economically thriving under such oppression. The foundations of the complex had been built, but we still couldn't see the complex itself. The complex was hidden under paragraphs of obscure text and in college curricula at places like Tulane University, under the unlikely auspices of American Studies. Talk about a wolf in sheep's clothing. It all seemed so benign, and we figured that if college students went off and had sex and did drugs and engaged in teenage rebellious decadence, oh well, they'd eventually come back to the Constitution just the way their parents had. We slept while the other side armed, and while we snoozed, they secretly stole away our defensive weaponry, our allegiance to the Constitution and to freedom of speech and opinion. It was only when they fired the first shots over our bow that we noticed we were unarmed, and that they had weaponized the cloudy bacteria of their philosophy into full-bore ideological anthrax, ready to deploy on a moment's notice. The line was becoming clear. Marx and Hegel had paved the way for the progressives, who in turn had paved the way for the Frankfurt School, who had then attacked the American way of life by pushing cultural Marxism through critical theory. The Frankfurt School thinkers had come up with the rationale for radical environmentalism, artistic communism, psychological deconstruction of their opponents, and multiculturalism. Most of all, they had come up with the concept of repressive tolerance, aka political correctness. They had penetrated the academies. My American Studies program at Tulane had far more Adorno and Gramsci and Horkheimer and Marcuse than Twain or Jefferson or Lincoln. There was some trickle-down intellectualism going on. All the college students who worked through these programs and took swigs from the Frankfurt School bottle labeled "Drink Me" shrank mentally and ended up as parts of the complex. But that didn't explain how American society as a whole was taken over by this stuff. I just couldn't understand it. How did Frankfurt School philosophy, which is obviously complicated, highfalutin stuff, become a mass psychosis? How did it trick so many millions of people? And I had another question, too. Frankfurt School philosophy was all about criticizing from the outside. It was about tearing down society by taking it apart, piece by piece, razing it to the ground. That stuff doesn't go over very well in this country because people here are generally happy. We don't see Disneyland as an emblem of corporate greed or capitalistic exploitation. We see it as a fun place to take our kids, and if somebody tried to tear down Disneyland in the name of the collective, we'd have a shit fit. So how did this outsider's philosophy penetrate our hearts and our minds? How did the complex, which was a huge philosophical system designed to take America head-on, recede into the background so much that a few decades later, we can't even recognize that it exists? Then I read Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals. If Marcuse was the Jesus of the New Left, then Alinsky was his St. Paul, proselytizing and dumbing down Marcuse's message and making it practical, and convincing leaders to make it the official religion of the United States, even if that meant discarding the old secular religion of the United States, the Constitution. Rules for Radicals might just as well be entitled How to Take Over America from the Inside. It's theory made flesh. Alinsky laid it out step by step, but we were too busy fighting the results to read his game plan. Let's start by noting who Saul Alinsky was. Alinsky was an avowed communist, dedicated to installing communism in America from the inside, using the most clever tactical means he could devise. He was born in 1909 in Chicago, and like his Frankfurt School counterparts, he quickly migrated toward Marx. He attended the University of Chicago and majored in archaeology, but dumped that after he couldn't get a job. After working as a criminologist, he became a community organizer. Yes, a community organizer, for the Congress of Industrial Organizations, CIO, a major union run by John L. Lewis, an anti-communist leftist who actually pushed for the election of Republican Wendell Willkie in the 1940 election in the hopes that if Willkie were elected with CIO help, the CIO could win major concessions. From Lewis, whom Alinsky called one of the most outstanding figures of our time, Alinsky learned hard-nosed tactics, and he applied those hard-nosed tactics to his own Marxism. One of the crucial lessons he learned was that he had to work from the inside. Whereas new left leaders like Marcuse preferred to bash the system from the outside and alienate all those who were part of it, Alinsky knew that it was more important to pose as an insider to achieve his aims. It worked brilliantly. Time magazine bought into Alinsky's act in a 1970 profile. It is not too much to argue that American democracy is being altered by Alinsky's ideas. In an age of dissolving political labels, he is a radical, but not in the usual sense, and he is certainly a long way removed from new left extremists. This, of course, was not true, not in the slightest. His own beliefs were intensely close to those of Marcuse and the Frankfurt School. It was only his practicality and pragmatism that distinguished him and made him infinitely more effective. Alinsky took on the trappings of American constitutionalism in order to insinuate himself insidiously into the American consciousness. He scorned flag burning as counterproductive. He talked about the founders on a regular basis. He even posed as a conservative when it suited his purposes. Time sums up the popular view of Alinsky, a view he cultivated with minute forethought. Alinsky claims to be doing nothing more un-American than following the precepts of the Founding Fathers. In the Federalist Papers, James Madison warned against allowing any class or faction to acquire too much power. In his own way, Alinsky is trying to redress the balance of power within contemporary America. If the desire to preserve basic American principles makes one a conservative, then he indeed qualifies. He surely offers proof, if any is needed, that significant change can be accomplished within the American system. This about a man who constantly cited communism as his governing philosophy. It is no wonder Alinsky was so effective. Alinsky summarized his strategy for instituting Marxist change in his 1971 book, Rules for Radicals, a pragmatic primer for realistic radicals. It's actually an excellent book, clear where Marcuse is foggy, irreverent where Adorno is stagnant, dirty and funny where Horkheimer is abstruse and boring. The book's dedication page explains in a nutshell what was so dangerous about Alinsky. He mixed a dash of religious fervor, a sprinkle of American founding talk, and a heavy dose of kiss my ass into a concoction that was relatively easy and fun to swallow. The first page has an epigraph from Rabbi Hillel, one from Thomas Paine, and finally Alinsky's kiss my ass epigraph. Lest we forget at least an over-the-shoulder acknowledgement to the very first radical. From all our legends, mythology, and history, and who is to know where mythology leaves off and history begins, or which is which, the very first radical known to man who rebelled against the establishment and did it so effectively that he at least won his own kingdom. Lucifer. Only a true egoist would cite himself in his epigraph, but that was what made Alinsky so unique. His brazen disregard for tradition sewn together with the dressings of majority society. Alinsky immediately makes clear where he stands on politics. He's a Marxist, and a pragmatic Marxist at that. Alinsky's role as a pragmatic communist is to succeed where his fellow radicals had failed. He despises those impractical Marxists who panic and run, rationalizing that the system is going to collapse anyway of its own rot and corruption. Those who go hippie or yippie, taking drugs, trying communes, anything to escape. Those who went berserk, the weathermen and their like. He laughs at the college students who embrace Marcusean philosophy while doing nothing. those who spend their time cribbing from the communist puppet masters and wear Che t-shirts. He also knows that America's openness provides communists the opportunity to destroy American values, which makes working from the outside a waste of time. Militant outsiderism is counterproductive. Alinsky, first and foremost, knows that to win, communists must communicate in the language of the people. They must embrace the people, not scorn them. They must embrace the world as it is, not as they wish it were. As an organizer, Alinsky writes in Donald Rumsfeld-like language, I start from where the world is, as it is, not as I would like it to be. That means working inside the system. The people, Alinsky thinks, are like happy sheep. In order to steer them in the politically correct direction, they first must be made unhappy, and that unhappiness will result in passivity, then finally in discontent, and then, in the end, revolution. Incrementalism, as Frankfurt School's Antonio Gramsci taught, is the name of the game. And the only way to begin opening the door to the revolution is to make people unhappy with the status quo. Revolutionaries aren't supposed to afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted. They're supposed to afflict everybody, making them long for a mass overturning of the system as a whole. After calling for the destruction of the system John Adams helped create, Alinsky, with his typical aplomb, actually quotes John Adams to back him up. Adams must have been spinning wildly in his grave as Alinsky dug out his dog-eared Adams quotebook. Alinsky's clever merging of fake founding philosophy with his own Marxism led him to internal contradictions that would have sunk a lesser ego. While championing freedom, for example, he hated the idea of individual freedom the founders loved. He wanted communal freedom, which is to say, tyranny led by the government. The greatest enemy of individual freedom is the individual himself, he wrote. This is typically Rousseauian messaging. Community trumps the individual, and, in fact, individualism can only exist within the body politic. In other words, workers of the world unite from within the system. And he united his ideas under the rubric of change. Yes, change. He also liked hope, because his personal philosophy is anchored in optimism. Sound familiar? Alinsky says he's not looking for a Marxist revolution, but he is looking to provide a manual for the have-nots against the haves. That sounds an awful lot like Marxism to me. All of this is great rhetoric, but how would Alinsky actually build his forces? How would he find his minions? By finding the raw materials. He tells us straight out what he's looking for in a community organizer. First off, he looks for flexibility. That means moving from method to method, argument to argument, fighting like a guerrilla rather than like a coordinated army. Don't worry about methodological consistency, says Alinsky. Just do what you have to in order to win. Alinsky believes that the ends justify the means as a general rule. He believes that fearing corruption of your internal values only leads to paralysis, and that the only way to truly win is to abandon yourself wholly to your ends. As Stalin would have put it, you have to break a few eggs to make an omelet. Alinsky liked omelets. This obviously runs directly counter to the notions of Judeo-Christian morality, which ardently state that right ends cannot justify wrong means. That is why American society has such a tough time handling Alinsky's acolytes. He didn't play by their rules, and they couldn't play by his rules. Alinsky simply didn't care about Judeo-Christian morality. He was a total moral relativist who declared, without batting an eye, one man's positive is another man's negative. He actually made the argument that Nazi resistors weren't objectively moral to the Nazis. Winners write history, says Alinsky, so you'd better be the winner. That holds particularly true in war, where the end justifies almost any means, and Alinsky views all politics, and actually all life, as war. If you have the option of using moral means, by all means use them, says Alinsky. If not, Screw 'em. As he said in his usual colorful language, the alternative to corrupt victory is to go home defeated with my ethical hymen intact. And he was no virgin. His bottom line is plain and unvarnished. Kick ass, and then pretend you were doing the moral thing. Lie, cheat, and steal for victory. If you have to lie to win, then lie and win. Then lie about your lie. If you have to win with brutality, then be brutal and win, and then rewrite history about your brutality. Always cloak your goals in widely agreed upon American terms that people buy into. Things like the Declaration of Independence or the common welfare provision of the Constitution. Sure, you may be standing for none of those things, but that doesn't matter. Victory is what matters. It's the Chicago way. Second, Alinsky looks for confidence. Weak-willed people never win, and those who doubt themselves are weak-willed. It takes confidence to go after your opposition with a chainsaw. Those who have self-confidence will not shy away from conflict, which is an essential feature of progress, he says, channeling Hegel. Third, Alinsky espouses the value of experience. Education as a community organizer means embracing Rousseau-like experiential learning. Since history doesn't repeat itself, all history is changeable and changing. This is also an excellent rationalization for young people to ignore the wisdom of the past. This time, just like every time, things are different. Fourth, Alinsky suggests certain various personal qualities in organizers. Here are some of the most important. Sincerity. The good community organizer must be absolutely honest and sincere. This is good advice for any politician, but it is excellent advice for someone trying to work with populations different from his or her own. Curiosity and irreverence. The organizer must be curious because everything needs to be questioned. Values must be questioned. Morals must be questioned. This is basically critical theory in practice. Alinsky's focus on reverence is particularly important. To the questioner, nothing is sacred. Again, this is critical theory in its most basic practical form. A sense of humor. This is probably the most important quality Alinsky mentions. Humor is a weapon to be deployed as often as possible. It is almost impossible to defend against. It is the weapon the Frankfurt School lacked. Their seriousness made them boring and inaccessible. Alinsky is no such thing. He is hilarious, and that hilarity breeds the sort of social change only a Jon Stewart or a Stephen Colbert could bring about rather than a Noam Chomsky. When it comes to humor, Alinsky has no problem going lowest common denominator, which is what makes him so effective. It's one thing to pun like Shakespeare when you're in polite company, but social change isn't effected in polite company. It's effected in the streets, with the people. And people love base humor. In the book, Alinsky makes jokes about sex and farting, both in order to shock and to cross cultural boundaries. After all, everybody poops. Conservatives are afraid to talk in these terms, and that's one reason why they lose young people in particular. As it stands, the Frankfurt School taught left is fighting the political battle on both the political and cultural battlefields. Conservatives are fighting it only on the political battlefield. That means that art, humor, song, theater, television, film, dance are all devices used every day in order to influence the hearts and minds of the American people. Conservatives have to pray that their kids will eventually discover George Will's column to knock some sense into them. Once he's got his organizers, his soldiers for the battlefield, Alinsky lays out his tactics. He's not just Machiavelli, he's Sun Tzu. Here are his rules for tactical warfare, quoted verbatim. 1. Power is not only what you have, but what the enemy thinks you have. Deception is useful, and giving the other side incomplete information is just as useful. If it was good enough for Gideon, it's good enough for Alinsky. 2. Never go outside the experience of your people. You can't preach abortion to Catholic priests or pork to Jews. Work with the material you have, or you'll confuse your own forces. 3. Wherever possible, go outside of the experience of the enemy. If they can't handle you because they've never handled anything like you, you'll win. 4. Make the enemy live up to their own book of rules. Alinsky writes, "You can kill them with this, for they can no more obey their own rules than the Christian church can live up to Christianity." Hypocrisy is obviously the key word here, and it's the left's favorite charge for the simple reason that the vast majority of people with standards are hypocrites at some point in their lives. 5. Ridicule is man's most potent weapon. Just ask Gerald Ford, Chevy Chase, George W. Bush, Will Ferrell, or Sarah Palin, Tina Fey. 6. A good tactic is one that your people enjoy. You're not going to win if your people are bored out of their minds. 7. A tactic that drags on too long becomes a drag. 8. Keep the pressure on. 9. The threat is usually more terrifying than the thing itself. Don't be scared of the opposition. Even if they level their most feared weapon at you, it probably won't be that bad. Meanwhile, level threats whenever possible, because that will scare the opposition. 10. The major premise for tactics is the development of operations that will maintain a constant pressure upon the opposition. Pressure causes reactions, and you can work off of the reaction of your target. 11. If you push a negative hard and deep enough, it will break through into its counterside. Find the enemy's most cherished belief, then exploit it against your target. Alinsky uses the example of passive resistance in India. By exploiting the British pride in their civility, Gandhi defeated them. It goes without saying that the Frankfurt School used precisely this tactic in twisting their First Amendment freedoms against the First Amendment in the United States. 12. The price of a successful attack is a constructive alternative. Make sure you have a plan once you've achieved your goals. 13. Pick the target, freeze it, personalize, and polarize it. This is the most important and famous of Alinsky's rules. You have to pick a target, then freeze it, and prevent it from shifting blame elsewhere, then personalize it by making sure that it is something specific and identifiable rather than general, and finally, polarize it by demonizing it. It does you no good to talk about the pros and cons of your target. You must show the target as entirely evil and yourself as entirely good. This is commonly known as the politics of personal destruction. See Palin, Sarah. Finally, Alinsky provides a simple reminder. The real action is in the enemy's reaction. You must provoke your enemy into reacting so that you can work off of the reaction. If you do a good enough job, you can force them to make a mistake. When they do, you must be ready to exploit it. It's worth exploring one of Alinsky's case studies in order to see these rules in action. In 1964, he moved to Rochester, New York, in the aftermath of race riots and targeted Eastman Kodak, the largest company in town by far. He quickly implemented Rules 13, target, freeze, personalize, and polarize, and 5, mockery is the best strategy. The media interviewed him when he stepped off the plane in Rochester, asking him what he thought of the town. "It is a huge southern plantation transplanted north," Alinsky said. This got him the reaction he was looking for from the opposition, which gave him more targets to attack. W. Allen Wallace, president of the University of Rochester and director at Eastman Kodak, went after Alinsky. Alinsky responded by comparing Wallace to George Wallace of Alabama. Did it matter if the charge was true? Of course not. But it was effective. Putting into action the rest of his rules, using the law as a tool to make the establishment obey its own rules, moving outside the experience of the enemy, letting your soldiers enjoy the experience, etc., Alinsky suggested another tactic in Rochester, a flamboyant and outrageous tactic sure to get a response simply because of its pure outrageousness. He suggested that blacks buy tickets to the Rochester Symphony Orchestra, eat beans beforehand, then fart over and over again to disturb the upper-class white folks. This is brilliant. Farting for a cause is about as smart as you can get because there's no way to defend against it. It's not illegal to fart. It's completely offensive and makes people uncomfortable. And even as black folks are passing gas in a chamber music concert, they get to claim the moral high ground and pillory their enemies as racists. Alinsky is infuriatingly awesome. He's smart where his compatriots are intellectual, and always reaches his intended audience, something professors often fail to do. He knows what he wants and how to get it, and he makes it easy for anyone to follow his pattern. The trickle-down intellectualism of Marcuse and Horkheimer might have worked on a college level, where students substituted professors for parents as authority figures and felt liberated by their new, less stodgy, be-yourself quasi-parents, but it took the brilliance of an Alinsky to bring the Marcuse Marxist creed to the common man by fooling him into thinking it was purely American. It took Alinsky's thug tactics to enervate the happy, healthy American middle class and get them to accept major changes to the status quo, and to mobilize the racial and sexual identity groups that Marcuse needed to substitute for the generally complacent middle class. It took Alinsky to shut up the opposition using the methodologies of political correctness, to frighten people into submission and create an informal anti-First Amendment regime where if you speak out, you become a personal target. It took Alinsky to put the complex totally into effect. Every successful interest group and social movement in the United States since the 1960s has used Frankfurt School ideology and Alinsky rules. It's tragic it has taken conservatives so long to realize it. Chapter 7. Pragmatic Primer for Realistic Revolutionaries. After I wrote Hollywood Interrupted, and as I was helping create a conservative Hollywood network and creating the barrel full of liberal eggs that is the Huffington Post, I felt good. My journey into the culture wars had begun auspiciously. We were making strides by using the left against itself at the Huffington Post and by creating a conservative underground in Hollywood. But I hadn't been tested by fire. I hadn't felt the pressure cooker. I hadn't put myself out in the open. What would happen once I forayed into the bright sunlight of public scrutiny and faced the music? I was about to find out. In March 2005, I got invited to appear on the HBO program Real Time with Bill Maher. At the time, the left was starting to get its sea legs in terms of framing the Iraq War as illegitimate and President Bush as a heinous commander-in-chief. I knew the audience would be composed of Maher's loyalists, the MoveOn.org plants. It wasn't my first time before a studio audience. I'd done the Dennis Miller Show many times, but this was my first time before a hostile studio audience. It went relatively well. I defended Bush on the war, which made me performer non grata, but I also got off a couple of one-liners, especially one mitigating the concern that people were having about teenage boys having sex with attractive 20-something teachers. At the time, there was a spate of those things happening, and I said something predictable that your average red-blooded male would say, explaining that there's a double standard and a fundamental difference between a teenage girl having sex with her older male teacher and a teenage boy having sex with his hot female teacher. It was a throwaway line that, in my mind, ameliorated my presence on the panel, a line that conveyed that I wasn't one of those stodgy conservatives. I got off the show after having been fearful of the audience and Maher pummeling me, and I had survived without a problem. Maybe I'll get invited back again, I thought to myself. At the post party, I received universal plaudits from the cast and crew, and I was treated like a regular citizen by Bill Maher and by an actor from the West Wing. It felt good to be patted on the back instead of being treated like a pariah. I was riding high. The following Monday, I got a call from a friend of mine, a closeted conservative Hollywood film